O tēnā koutou katoa, no America ho no te tematanga, no ototahi toku kainga e nei nei, e roia toku tunga mahi o Perryfield Lawyers, ko Steven Moe toku ingoa, no reira ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Hi everyone, my name's Steven Moe. I'm going to be going through some legal things for you tonight, particularly with a focus on churches and charities and some changes to the Charities Act. Before we get underway, I'm just going to have a brief karakia to get us started. Kia tau, kia tato, kia rite tato, kia u tato, kia whakaro nui kia tato, kia manoa nui, kia whakaute kia tato, Mauri ora ki te whare, tuturu whakamaua kia tina, tina, haumie, huie, taikie. So I'll just hand over to you, Chris, to say a few words at the start.
Wonderful. Kia ora, Stephen, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight on this session made possible thanks to the generosity of Steven Moe and the Perryfield team. So just really want to give a shout out to them. And but we just wanted to take this opportunity. Many of you will know me in my role as National Administrator for Elim, New Zealand, the Elim Churches of New Zealand. But I also wear another hat in that I chair the Interchurch Bureau, which is an ecumenical group that works right across the body of Christ with a lot of the movement and denominations, well over 35 movement denomination general managers, national secretaries, and we meet together regularly and look at issues around charities and tax and employment and all those sorts of things, compliance issues that we all have to face and deal with. So it's great working across the body of Christ in that space, and a real privilege to be involved in that. And so we're here tonight mostly under the Interchurch Bureau banner. Just wanting to have the session tonight with Steven just to really remind us of the changes that took place in the amendment to the Charities Act, and just making sure that within our own charities, whether it be churches or other Christian organisations that we may be involved with, that we are aware and making sure that we're doing the appropriate things as required under the new Act. And if we do have some time at the end, we might just touch briefly a little bit on the current issue at the moment, which of course is the taxing of charities space at the moment, which is gaining a bit of traction in the media and obviously through the government. So before I hand back to you, Stephen, I would just like to really just acknowledge the work that you do, Stephen. Stephen has said he's one of the partners for Perryfield Law, and Steve specialises in the charity space, and you're an absolute gift to not only the church in New Zealand but charities in New Zealand. The material and the resources that you freely make available for charities to be able to get on and do their work and make sure they're informed and all those sorts of things is just absolutely amazing. And it's an absolute privilege to know you and work alongside you in that space. So really thank you so much for your big heart in this area, because it's just phenomenal. So thank you so much for making yourself available tonight for this. So I'll hand over to you and you can take it away. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that introduction. And I'm really looking forward to this session. I would love it if we were all in a room together and I could look out and you could raise your hand and ask questions and it was like that. But we're going to make the best of technology. And the beauty of technology is that you are joining me from all across this amazing country. So we had in the chat people in Invercargill right through up into the top of the North Island. So I think that's a beautiful thing, that actually this content can be accessible wherever it is that you happen to be. So just a brief introduction from me. As Chris said, I'm a partner at Perryfield Lawyers, and this session is really going to be focusing in for charities and churches. And it's going to be broad enough where if you're not from a church itself, but you're in an aligned charity or a charity in general, this is going to be relevant for you as well. As I'm conscious some people have joined from different links that maybe got forwarded and you're wondering, what is this about? So that's the context. Really brief introduction on my accent, which I always feel compelled to at least mention. I'm from America originally, but moved to Aotearoa back in 1984. And I saw in the chat somebody said that they're from Amaru, and so that's near where I moved. I was on the Waitaki River near a place called Papakayo, so a very small little blink and you miss it place. started in Standard 3. Who remembers standards back when that was the thing? And Standard 3 and Standard 4 were together in one room. So it was a very rural upbringing. My dad's a marine biologist, so he was raising salmon. We then moved to Christchurch, to Otatahi in 1989. So I went to high school here, I went to Canterbury University, and I started practicing as a lawyer in 2001. I worked in Wellington, then I left and worked in London, Tokyo, Sydney. And about 8 years ago, my children came home and they were singing the beautiful Australian national anthem. So we thought it's time to make a decision here. Is this where we want to have as our base, or do we want to get back to Aotearoa? So that was 8 years ago, decided to come back and really focus on impact and purpose as the guiding filter for what type of work that I'm doing. So as Chris mentioned, I'm helping lots of churches, lots of charities, lots about governance, legal structures. What are the ways to update documents and get them in order? We have about 100 people in our law firm, so there's quite a few of us working in this particular area and 12 of us in the impact team. So that's a little bit of background, like why is this person talking? Where is this accent from? So hopefully you can now know a bit of the context of why I've been asked to share with you. I'm really keen to find out if there's other topics that you're interested in as well, because I'd love to do these more often, more frequently, as a way to resource charities across the country. So I know you know how to use the chat function, because many of you wrote where you are and what the weather's like where you are. So feel free to put in the chat, what is your question? And I'll try to get to it during the session. And as I'm talking, feel free to type in the chat if something I've said sparks a question for you, or if you want to make another comment or add to what I've said, or that's a good point, I also found this other thing helpful, then be really great to hear from you. See, see it's working. Joanna has put their privacy springs to mind instantly. So we can definitely talk about privacy. So put the topics in the chat, and we'll make sure that we try to cover as much as we can, or we have a part 2 at some point in the future. So what I want to do is cover 3 main things. The first one is there were some changes to the Charities Act, which have been coming in a staggered way over the last year and a half. I would love to tell you the key things from it. Obviously, there's lots of changes, but I'm just going to focus on the top 5 things that I think you need to know. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about a case called Mainzeal, which some of you might have heard of from the business pages, and you might be thinking, how does that relate to charities or churches? But I'm going to explain why it's important that you understand what that case was about. And then finally, I'm going to look at what's on the horizon. And as Chris kind of hinted, there's a consultation which is happening for charities right now. In fact, it finishes on the 31st of March. So you have literally about how many working days? About 4 days left. So that is looking at proposing changes to tax unrelated business income of charities. But my fear is that it opens a door and there might be further changes in the future. So I think it's important for all charities to be submitting on the topic, and I can go into why that is when we get to that part. I've been writing quite a lot on this topic, and we've done some reports and videos and lots of information. So for those of you who I can see are madly scrambling down your notes and scribbling away, I do have a set of PowerPoint. So after this call, I'm going to hit send, and you're going to get a PowerPoint which will go into some of the detail. So don't worry too much about trying to write down everything that I'm saying. Also, this is being videoed so that I'll be able to send a link. So if it's helpful and you think it would help others that you're on boards with or other leaders, you'll be able to hit forward and you can make sure the content gets to other people as well. So the changes that we're talking about, the Charities Act, this is the Charities Act 2005, and the changes came through in 2023 and 2024. They were kind of staggered. So there were some changes in July 2023, then some in October 2023, and then some in July 2024. The ones, well, the first thing is that it's basically they're trying to align some of the legislation so that it's more consistent. So they're trying to bring in concepts around governance so that it applies across whatever entity type you are, that there will be consistent ways of approaching governance. So as well as this change, if any of you are involved with incorporated societies, you might have, or you may know that there's been a new act called the Incorporated Societies Act 2022 that also brought in additional changes around governance and how you have your rules and what they need to say. So basically, this is part of an overarching move to provide more consistency when it comes to, well, what is governance? What is an officer? So the key changes that I think you need to be aware of is, number one, that you now need to be reviewing your governance and your documents regularly. Number two, who is an officer? And guess what? It might be some of you on the call who you didn't think you were an officer. Number three, how do officers get disqualified? And number four, what does it mean for accumulation of funds? So they've changed some of the rules around how you hold your funds if you're a charity. So as we go through this, again, drop me comments as we're going, and I'll be able to hopefully answer them. If I see them and they're related, I'll be able to answer them as we go. So the first thing is reviewing governance procedures. So the basic change here is that in the past, there was not a requirement for charities to review their rules. Now, I don't know about you, but many rules have been written decades ago. So this is a little challenge. When was the last time that you looked at the rules of your charity? I'm willing to bet that if we took a poll of all 100 of you who are on the call, a large portion would have rules that were written on a typewriter. And that's because very often these documents get written, they get signed, and then they get put in the bottom drawer. Nobody really looks at them again until something goes wrong or until somebody says, what are our purposes again? So this is the first big change, is that the new provision requires that every 3 years you need to be certifying and stating that you have reviewed your rules and your governance procedures. So it's actually wider than just if you're a trust, a trust deed, or a constitution, or the founding document. It's actually, I think, covering policies and covering board charters or other documents as well. But every 3 years, you need to be saying, yes, the terminology is our rules are fit for purpose. They're fit for purpose. So my question for all of you is, well, firstly, have you looked at your rules? Secondly, if they are written on a typewriter, or even if they were written 10 years ago or 5 years ago, do they reflect the way that your organization operates? And if they were written some time ago and you haven't looked at them, I can almost guarantee you that there will be something in those rules that surprises you. And you go, oh, are we meant to be giving 2 weeks written notice before we hold a meeting? That's what this clause says. Or, oh, are we meant to have a count of the quorum every single time and record it in a register of members? Well, that's what this clause says. So there's going to be things in your rules that you aren't doing. So I wouldn't stress about it. I wouldn't say, oh my goodness. Well, if I was being pedantic, I would say, have all of your meetings been validly called if you're not following your rules? But let's not go there. Let's give a blanket of I guess, grace and say, actually, the point is, if our rules don't reflect the way that we operate, why don't we update them so that they do reflect the way that we operate? And then we can easily tick the box. We have reviewed our governance procedures. We have made sure that our rules are fit for purpose. The reason that this is important is that it's actually protecting you if you're a trustee or if you're an officer. Because if you have outdated rules, it probably has not kept pace with legislative changes. So I'm going to choose a specific entity type, and I'm aware that some of you will say, I'm an incorporated society, or I'm an unincorporated society, or I'm a different entity type. But many of you will be charitable trusts. Charitable trusts have had the law around them changed in the Trust Act 2019. It came into force at the start of 2021, but what it did was reformed the law of trusts. So if you have a trust and your trust deed is any time before 2019, I can almost guarantee you, well, I will guarantee you, it doesn't currently talk about the Trust Act 2019. So why does this matter? It matters because the key reform in the Trust Act was to codify, that means put into legal language, the duties of trustees. There were always duties of trustees, but now they're very clearly written down. And there's two types. The first are called mandatory duties. Mandatory duties cannot be changed. You cannot alter them. They are what they are in the Act. But there's another type of duty called the default duties. Default duties, the reason it's phrased that way is that they are the default unless your trust deed modifies them. So you get the key point here. If your trust deed changes the duties of trustees, then it can modify the default position in the Charities Act. So in the Trust Act. So this is quite important to do because it can allow your trustees to have more discretion, more decision making, reduce their liability by adjusting what is written in your trust deed. So in our template trust deed, we've used it with about 50 new charities in the last year and a whole bunch of others who are revising their trust. We have a whole schedule and it goes into all of the default duties and then it modifies and tweaks them. So it changes what the default is to being specific for that particular charity. So I hope that this is clear enough. There's a reason why, for your protection, that you might want to modify your rules. The first one is it protects your officers and your trustees because it reflects the modern day requirements. The second is that I guarantee you your rules are probably in need of a brush up if they were written 5 years ago. And some of you were written 70 years ago. The oldest ones that I've dealt with are back in the 1920s. So if you get a document from 100 years ago, you know, there's a lot that needs improving. Yeah, so that's change number one that I want to have on your radar. So the practical consequence of this, the next meeting that you have of your board or your trustees or your elders or your kaitiaki or whatever it is that you call your leadership group, maybe it's worth pulling out your dusty old trust deed or your dusty old rules and having a look at it because you're now legally required to check and make sure that it is fit for purpose. So if this is intriguing, when I send out the follow-up email, I'll have some links to some guides about the types of things that you should be thinking about when it comes to your rules. But my basic, this is really rule of thumb advice here, but print out your rules, get a green highlighter, a yellow highlighter, and a red highlighter, and go through, and green means go. It still applies, let's keep this. Yellow means not really sure, is this needed or not? Red means, I don't know why this is in our trust deed. We really need to improve this. Let's update it and get rid of it. So it's a quick rule of thumb to be able to go through and potentially work out what it is that you want to change. So hopefully that's helpful and maybe a reminder. The final thing on this is, when did you last look at the purposes of your charity? I meet many charities that started, for example, we're going to run a preschool, and then some funding comes up. Oh, we could do some high school student mentoring, and then some other funding comes up. Oh, we could do some mental health and suicide prevention for university students. And over the years, what happens is that the organization drifts away from the original purpose, and it's starting to do things like it was set up to be a preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds. Now it's suicide prevention for university students. You've probably strayed from your original purpose, and you need to either refresh your purposes if you're allowed, or consider what you're doing, and maybe you need to come back to the original thing that you were set up to do. Or you need to start another thing which does that and get back to your roots. So this could be a challenging conversation. Like, you might need to think about your purpose, and also you might need to articulate it in a way that is in modern language. I just helped a Christian charity, not a church, it was been going for 50 years. But the terminology that was very common and totally acceptable in 1974 was not so easy to understand in 2024. So we rewrote the whole thing and were able to update it. And so now when they go out and they're talking with people, they have the terminology to use that makes sense. And I guarantee you that some of your documents will say things like, the trustees will appoint the chairman. Like it's just a bit outdated from what we would say today, which might be a chairperson rather than chairman. So there's lots of little things that can creep into documents like that. All right, that was probably the longest one that I'm going to do, so don't worry, we're moving on to number 2, and that is the officer's definition. So the key thing here is, in the past, the definition of officers was pretty well understood, in the sense of, if you're a trustee or if you're involved in the governance, if you're on the board, essentially, then you're an officer. The definition has now expanded, and it now is included anyone with, and this is the key word, significant influence over substantial decisions. That's the phrasing. And that means that it could include other people than what you might think is covered. So, for example, if your charity or your church has a leadership team and they are the trustees, or they're on the board, that they are covered. They are the officers. But it might also extend if you have someone who, for example, is running the human resources function within your organization. So they're not on the board, but you probably could argue that they do have a substantial influence over significant decisions. In the Act, it actually gives the example of a CEO, so a Chief Executive Officer, and it also gives the example of a CFO, a Chief Financial Officer. So you might not use those terminologies within your context, but you get the point. They might not be board members, but they might now be captured if they exercise significant influence over substantial decisions. So this is something to think about, like who is in this officer's definition and who is not. The reason this is important is that officers are then captured within the Act, and they have to act in a certain way. So there could be breaches of duties of officers, and they may not even be aware that they're an officer because they're not realizing that there's an updated definition, an expanded definition. In the PowerPoint I send out, in the email, I'll also include a link to a paper that I wrote about this so that you can find the wording for yourself in case this is of interest to you. All right, the third change is actually continuing the theme of officers, and that is how they're disqualified. So I guess the good news here is that it does take something serious. So there has to be serious wrongdoing, or they have to have failed significantly or persistently to meet the obligations under the Charities Act. In my experience, Charities Services, which is the regulator of charities, they're often very willing to have dialogue with a charity about what's gone on, what's happened. So there's often the chance to explain the context and things before the act of disqualifying someone would be brought into force, because there might be extenuating circumstances or things that are relevant. But it's something to be aware of. I'm just trying to highlight some of the key changes that are probably going to be relevant to you all. The fourth one is that charities need to now report on their accumulated funds. Now, this is actually a really interesting, almost, I think, a philosophical question. And the reason I put it that way is that why is it that government would want to know what happens to your funds? If you receive donations, then shouldn't it be up to the charity to determine how those funds are used? So the reason this is significant is that if your charity has more than 140,000 in annual expenditure, so this is not for the smallest charities, this is more for the, getting a little bit bigger. But I'd say most churches would probably easily meet that, depending on the context. But the key change is that charities need to provide information about their reasons for holding funds. So this is obviously quite important because many times charities will hold funds and they won't use them to advance their purpose because they have a building project coming up, or because they're putting money aside because the roof is going to need to be repaired, or because there's a plan to expand and have a second site at another location, or we're going to build a community housing project next door to our facility. So there are good reasons why you might accumulate your funds. The shift is that in your annual reports, you're going to have to say how much you have in accumulated surplus, and then you're going to have to essentially justify it. And the question says, how do you plan to use your charity's accumulated funds in the future? And then it says, things to consider: how accumulating funds will help to achieve your charity's goal of advancing your charitable purpose, and specific reasons for accumulating your funds, i.e. planning for future generations, or the sustainability of your charity, or upcoming significant projects, or planned capital expenditure like buildings. So I'm just alerting you to some of these key changes, and I think it is significant because I guess my fear is what comes next. If you put we're accumulating our funds, I think it's going to be wide enough where you'll be able to have some reason, for future generations or to future-proof, to be sustainable. I think that's going to be acceptable, but at some point, does this mean that there's also going to be a follow-up question, which is, why haven't you used those funds? You said 5 years ago that you were going to do a building project, but you haven't used them yet, so get on with it. I don't know. It's just part of the, I guess, potential if they're collecting that information. So I tend to be a glass half full person, so I don't think that I hope that that's not the intent, but it is a subtle shift in what we're required to report on. So that's why I wanted to draw it to your attention. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see what will come next. And that actually relates in, I'm going to talk a little bit about charities and tax as we continue on through. And it does start to intersect because the IRD's consultation paper has a section which talks about donor-controlled charities, which is basically where wealthy people have put funds into a charity and they have a for-profit business and how they interact. But one of the suggestions is that if there are funds that haven't been used for charitable purpose, that 5% or 6% or a percentage must be used each year to advance the charitable purpose. So it's interesting. I actually have sympathy with this. Like, I'll be totally honest. I know that there's some charities out there that literally have $100 million and they're not using it to advance their purpose. They are putting it away in bank accounts. And I think that there is a responsibility to consider the purpose for which you were endowed the funds when it comes to thinking about your use of the funds. And actually, the most common reaction I get is, yeah, but we're saving it for the rainy day. And unfortunately, guess what? It's raining now. So I think maybe there is a bit of a thing that maybe some of you on the call need to think about. Is there a reason why we're keeping this 50 million or 10 million or 1 million for some future purpose when actually we could use it for good today. So yeah, really interesting topic. In the follow-up I've written a legal opinion for trustees of trusts where I'm suggesting that they now have a duty to consider how they invest their capital rather than just how they use the interest or the profits that come from the investment. In other words, if you've got 10 million, it's no longer just put the 10 million into a bank account and consider how you use the interest that results. I think there's now a duty to consider how you invest the 10 million itself. So for example, you might need to think about it, or you should think about investing some of it into an impact investment. Social housing would be a good example. Like take 10% of your 10 million and invest it into a social housing project. You get financial return, you help people in your community into housing. Tick, tick, like win-win in both ways. So that's another topic, and look for the follow-up email if you're interested or intrigued by what I'm saying. Now, I just thought I'd mention Mainzeal, and some of you have probably seen in the newspaper the last few years, it was probably over in the business pages, but Mainzeal, I think, does have implications for the governance of charities. So essentially, Mainzeal was a construction company. It was chaired by an ex-prime minister. So it raised the stakes in terms of interest. Dame Jenny Shipley was the chair for about 10 years from, I think it was about 2003 till about 2013 or so. 2012, maybe it went into liquidation, owing $110 million to creditors. So a really big deal. Like it's, a lot of people lost a lot. And I've met people whose businesses almost went under because of the flow on of not getting paid by the Mainzeal liquidation. So essentially, the court looked at it and said that the directors had breached their duties and that they had traded recklessly and that they had continued operating the company past the point that they should have. And they had relied on assurances from their shareholder. Don't worry, it'll be fine. We'll cover you if there's ever any issues. It'll be okay. But they didn't get it in writing. They had emails, they had verbal assurances, but it wasn't put into writing. And so the court basically said three key things. Don't rely on assurances. If somebody says they're going to cover everything, you need to take caution and make sure that it's in writing. The second thing is you need to get advice early. So if your charity is facing trouble, get external advice. Could be an accountant or could be another, it could be a lawyer. And thirdly, know what your duties actually are so that you're able to satisfy your obligations. In the follow-up, there's going to be a link to a description of what the duties are. We don't have time to go into everything tonight, but I think a part two would be quite fun. So if it's of interest, I'm happy to go into that in more detail. So the reason that I'm mentioning this is, guess how much those directors were liable for? 3 of them were liable for $6 million each, and 1 of them was liable for $18 million. So I'm not meaning to scare you, but if an ex-Prime Minister of New Zealand can be held liable for breaching duties, I think all of us are potentially liable. So I think we have a duty to upskill in governance, to understand what our obligations are. And then I think this might be an interesting point to consider. How do we induct new people who are joining our governance boards? How do we train them? How do we let them know what our purposes are? So that's the key thing that we need to do is actually don't just at the next meeting of your board say, oh, by the way, Jane, it's wonderful to have you here. Okay, agenda item number 1. Like spend time with people, make sure that they know what the purpose is, how you're achieving it, and how you're articulating it in your policies and your documents and what you're doing. I'm going to respond to your comment there, Joanna. I actually thought emails were writing. Yes, they're writing, but they're not legally binding writing. So what they needed to do was get it into like a deed of guarantee, or a contract that would be enforceable rather than an email. The email basically says, dear directors, don't worry, we'll cover you. All the best. You know, it was very informal, so it wasn't a legally binding document. It was, but you're right, it was in writing. And I guess that's better than just a verbal assurance, but it still left a lot to be desired. All right, so there's some questions coming in. Thank you, Peter, for your comments as well. If anybody has a question, then I'd love to hear it. I thought maybe what I'd do is really briefly explain, because I've been using the word governance quite a lot. I think some of you maybe haven't come across the terms governance and management as much. So I just want to briefly explain what that is with a metaphor, and then I'm going to tell you about the charities and tax consultation. So I want you to imagine that you're on a ship and it's out in the ocean and there's waves and moving you up and down, and you're the captain and you're looking around the ship. Oh, there's a rip in the sail. Somebody go fix the rip. There's a leak over there. Somebody go plug the leak. We need to clean this deck. It's looking very messy. Somebody get onto it. That is management. That is running the day-to-day operations of the charity. And that's different to governance. So where would governance be on our metaphorical boat? They're not on the boat. They're in a helicopter, and the helicopter is flying a kilometer above, or make it 5 kilometers above the boat. And from that viewpoint, can they see the rip in the sail? No. Can they see the little leak that's just sprung? No. Can they see that the deck is dirty? Not really. Their job is not to look after the day-to-day running of the charity or the church. Their job is to do what? Be focused on strategy and future direction. And what their superpower is to call down to the ship and say, turn now, because there is an iceberg straight ahead. If you keep going as you are, you will crash into the iceberg and you will sink. So the job of governance is to be at the high level, the strategy, the thinking of the future, and then to be telling management where it is that we need to be headed. And maybe let's make a better picture than the iceberg. Maybe it's to this tropical island over here, which has amazing fruit and, plenty of nice beaches. We want to head that direction. But that's what governance is. Governance is at the high level, looking into the future, and not looking just a month from now, a year from now, 5 years from now. I think governance needs to be looking 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Here's a challenging one. 500 years from now. When did you last have an agenda item on your board saying the 500-year strategy session? But what would that change the dynamics? Like, if you're thinking of how many greats would that be? Great, 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 great grandchildren. What is the foundation that you're laying today in 2025 that it will allow your organization, your charity, your church to be operating really well in 2500, right? Like, I know it's really hard for us as limited humans to think that way, but it's an intergenerational perspective that I'm asking you to think about. And I think for many in this group, you'll naturally understand what I'm talking about, because this is really thinking beyond our lifetimes. It's about the seeds that we plant today. So my challenge to you on this point, next meeting you have, one of you look at the clock when you're talking about what happened last month, or what happened last Sunday service, or what happened at the fundraising dinner, the past, and then note down when you're talking about the future. When are you talking about the strategy? Where are we headed? How do we get there? Who do we collaborate with? Where can we partner? Is there another charity we can work with? I would be willing to bet that if we were to do that, right now, 75% of the time would be focused on the past, and maybe 25% would be focused on the future. I think many of you would agree I'm being generous there. Most of the time, we're focusing on what's happened rather than on what is coming. And I think that's a deficiency in our governance because it shows that we're worried about the rip in the sail and the little leak in the ship rather than thinking strategically long term. So my challenge to you would be, what would a meeting that you have of your group of, your board, whatever it is that you call them, what would it look like if you flipped that time? Try it for one meeting. 25% of the time is spent on the past. 75% of the time is spent on the future. What would that do to the tone of your meetings? What would that do in terms of succession planning? Who are we training up who will come in and take over from us? How are we preparing for a future that will inevitably come? So I hope this is a little bit challenging for some of you, and I hope that you take it to heart and go to your next board meeting and ask this future focused question. Look at your agenda. How much is on the past? How much is on the future? So I hope that this is helpful. On all of these topics, I could say a lot more, but obviously I'm trying to cover as many things as I possibly can. So what's on the horizon, I thought I'd mention the tax and the charities context because this is a really interesting stage that we're in. I just wrote an opinion piece for Stuff, which came out on Friday. And what I'll do is put it in the chat now so that you can have a read at your leisure. And this, so I'll just copy paste it in. So this article is going into the fact that I think we are perpetuating a mindset of reliance on donations as charities, and we haven't been focused on an innovation mindset where our charities are looking for sustainable income streams and looking to branch out beyond the Oliver Twist mentality, which is the metaphor I use in this little article. So have a read, see what you think. Essentially, to boil it down, the IRD has issued a consultation paper. There are 15 questions in that paper, and they're asking things like, should we start having a tax on unrelated business income of charities? So for many of you, you can breathe a sigh of relief here because you may not have any business income. You may rely on donations, and that's fine. That's all good. But some of you might be thinking, well, actually, we operate a cafe, or we operate a laundromat, or we have an investment in a business which is not related to our purpose. So the proposal is that potentially that income would be taxed. And the reason I think it's important that you all are aware of this is that I view it as an opening of a door that today they're talking about unrelated business income, but why would they stop there? Why not start to tax related business income? And why not tax passive business income? In other words, if you've got your fund sitting with a large investment fund manager putting into a fund, like where's the line to be drawn if this is a revenue-driven exercise? So the first few questions are all about, there's 15 questions. The first ones are all about tax on unrelated business income. Then they get into things like fringe benefit tax and removing that from charities. That could affect many of you. If you have employees and there's positive benefits from that you're able to utilize now under FBT rules, that could be about to change. There is some positive. They are encouraging that people should be using the donation tax credit scheme more. In other words, you get 1/3 back when you donate. Right now, you can apply for that at the end of the financial year. They're suggesting that that might be able to be applied for whenever you make the donation. So that is potentially a positive thing because you could have a fundraising drive or something in September and then you could give people their donation receipts and they could get the 1/3 back right away, rather than waiting until the end of financial year. So that's a positive change. I don't want to characterize it all as negative, but there are many things that will affect charities. So my encouragement is for all of you to upskill yourself on what the consultation paper is saying, and then consider submitting, even if it's a simple one-liner about that you're not in favor of it, or that this would potentially affect your income. And therefore, I mean, here's the key thing. If it's a charitable business, then it must ultimately go to the charitable purpose of the charity that owns the business. So it's not like it's going to private gain. It must be used for charitable purpose. And if there is more tax on charities' income, then there's less available for the charities to be doing good in our society. So I have a pretty fundamental problem, as you can tell, with the whole thesis about what is going on and why it's being done the way it's being done. In the chat right now, I'm putting a link to the papers and the videos that we've done on this topic. So a guy named Craig Fisher, who's an amazing accountant, ex-auditor, we wrote a paper together called Charities and Tax, Understanding the How and Why We Give Tax Concessions to Charities to Empower Their Impact. So if you click the link, you'll be able to get it. I will put it in the follow-up email as well. But we've done 2 video sessions, each an hour long, talking about all of this. So if it's of interest, there's plenty of content there. We've also written a guide for making submissions. So have a look, and you can have a look at that. Yeah. And I just see a comment there, operating a church camp starts to look like a business. Yeah, potentially it could. This will be one of the things that will be, remember I was talking at the start about thinking of your purpose and your rules and why you exist. I think this could trigger many organizations to consider how they phrase what they're doing. So a church camp, I think, instead of it saying we exist to make profit for our shareholder, which might then be a charity, I think it potentially would be rephrased around education of young people, supporting mental health of rangatahi, helping community develop, and potentially, depending on the type of camp, advancing the gospel. So that's interesting. Yeah, interesting points to raise. Just to relieve some of the tension that you may be feeling, there hasn't been a suggestion that there is a removal of the tax exemption for churches, although due to headlines caused by one church in particular, there have been calls for this. And it's unfortunate that one church leads to blanket statements being made about the more than 3,000 churches that exist across the country, that all religious charities should have their tax exemptions removed. That's not on the table with this consultation paper, but it is something that is part of the discussion, and I hear it and I see it in the media talked about relatively frequently. So I guess it's something that we need to be aware of, that may come up at some point. And here's an encouragement for you. When did you last tell the general public about the good work that your church or charity does? I know we're all busy. I know there's so much to do and we're focused, but we need to start telling our stories better so that the general public who have never walked in on a service or don't see the good work you're doing with the youth, with the elderly, with the people with drug addictions, with the mental health problems, all of the things that I know you're doing, start to tell the story so that we can make sure everybody knows the good that's done. In some ways, I put this down to wanting to be humble and not wanting to be the tall poppy. But the charities that I work with, they're all doing amazing work in the world. We need to be braver and we need to tell people about what we're doing, because part of the negative narrative that comes is when everybody looks at one charity and says, well, if that's what they're like, every other one of those must be like it as well. Whereas on this call, we know that that's not the case at all. So please tell your stories, get them out there, and make sure everybody hears them. So I'm going to turn to answer some questions. And then at the end of this session, Chris, we'll aim to finish at 8 o'clock. But if some of you have about 5 minutes extra, I would like to read you a little story. And I would like to hopefully bless you with that story. So Chris knows what story I'm referring to. I wrote a little one called The Apple Tree. And I'd love to read it to all of you after we finish the questions. If you have to go, then I totally understand, and that's fine, but I'll just read it at the very end. But before we do that, let's have a look at some of these questions which have come in, which is great. There are a lot of other resources I haven't had time to mention. So we do a charities health check. We have a guide for churches. We have a guide for charities. We have 7 key principles of governance for faith-based groups. Like, there's a lot of resources there. You can't say that there's not material if you're interested in upskilling your boards and understanding what it is that you need to do. So I'll send this out as a follow-up, and you can have a look at that. But Chris, should we have a little back and forth maybe? We can look at these questions because you might know some of the answers as well.
Yeah, great.
All right.
Thanks, Stephen. That's been outstanding. Hopefully people have found that really helpful. And again, Stephen's got lots of resources available to help out, so please make full use of those. Did you want to go back and have a look at some of those questions that have been put in the chat, Stephen?
Yeah, I think I'll just go back up to where I sort of
think
thought they were beginning. It looks like maybe Peter said should
yeah.
security put in their minutes when they reviewed the governance procedures if they decide that nothing needs changing. I'd say that's good policy. Yeah, I would definitely keep a record. If anybody ever asked, you looked at it. Minutes should record what it is that you've done. And if you've reviewed your words and it's fine, then yeah, I would put that in so that it's known. Yeah.
I think also, Stephen, on the charities form that you fill out now, I think there's a box or something you've got to tick to say that you've reviewed the rules or haven't reviewed the rules. And reviewing the rules just means looking through them, doesn't mean you have to make changes. You just need to make sure they're still fit for purpose, as Stephen's explained. And so you can tick that box to say, yes, we've done that, but we were all good. But always good to minute that as well.
Exactly. I totally agree. Yeah. All right. How much does government expect to receive by taxing charities' income? Studies show the work done amounts to 18 billion per annum. I doubt the government can fill that hole. Yeah. Well, this is actually, and Chris, you've commented there, this is actually the whole point in my mind. By increasing compliance costs of charities, how much will you actually get in? Like, there has to be a trade-off here. And if you read my article, you'll see what I'm saying is that it's perpetuating this idea that charities should just be getting donations. They shouldn't be forward-thinking and strategic and looking for more income streams. So it's a kind of cut off your nose to spite your face type of situation.
Stephen, I think there was another comment there by Peter, and I think someone else alluded it to before, especially perhaps in relation to the Methodist Church. But what should a registered charities do if their constitutional arrangements are embedded in private legislation passed in Parliament? Makes it a bit hard to review those rules and things. And then there was a further comment a little bit related about when you've got those kind of setups at a head office level, but then you've got local leadership teams in some of the parishes, where does the responsibility start and stop?
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously it's going to depend on the specific act or the statute or whatever it is that set you up. But it might be that you actually have to have a private member's bill, believe it or not, and you might need to go to Parliament and ask for an update or a change. So our firm has helped denominations to do this in the past. I know it sounds painful, and in some ways it is, but sometimes that's what you have to do. But it just depends on the context of your situation. And I think it's worth remembering there's many dynamics at play here. So there might be what traditionally we'd call a denomination or a movement. There might be a national body, and then there might be local congregations or local groups that in turn each have their own trust deed or their own rules. So there's some dynamics there, which Chris, you can speak to, which is that there should be alignment between the movement overall and then what's going on at the local level. So each There's no blanket statement here. Each context is unique. We've supported independent churches, we've supported churches that are part of denominations, and you just have to think about the dynamics that apply in each one.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I think as Stephen's alluding to there, we all want to be rowing the walker in the same direction, as it applies to our organizations and our churches. And that there's another comment from Peter. That registered charities provide a service performance report, which we all have to do. In fact, I was talking to someone about that today. And the good work we all mention, we put into those reports within that official document, but it is ignored. And I think you're very right there. We do a lot of work now. We have to put this statement of service performance into our annual accounts, and very few people actually read it. And yet that's a whole lot of good work that we want to try and say. And I think we've got to keep doing that. And legislatively, we have to do that. It's just a real shame that, from my perspective, that the government and other powers that be aren't looking at those to see the good work that charities are doing, and then are making all these other kind of knee-jerk reactions, perhaps as a response to other things that have happened out there in the public space. So I don't know what your comment on that is, Stephen.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that to me, though, is wanting to tell the story in a public way. So those reports is there ways that you could have a video on your website, or, have a newsletter, or put something up, a poster or something, just trying to draw attention to the good work that you're doing. But yeah, I don't have an easy solution. I just think we need to encourage each other to talk more, to talk ourselves up as charities, rather than letting the narrative be negative. So if we can't talk ourselves up, nobody else is going to. So yeah.
Jeff's got a question here. Would an early childhood centre manager likely be viewed as an officer?
I guess it depends what the manager does, or what their role is. It comes back to that definition, which I'll send around, the substantial influence. Yeah, it very possibly could be an officer if they're coming to the board and they're saying, here's the decision that we need to be made, and the board is saying, well, what do you think we should do? I would characterize that as having substantial influence. So yeah. And looks like Jeff has said there, how is the follow-up likely to look in regards to ensuring governance rules and procedures are being reviewed? Well, let you in on a little secret. There are 29,000 registered charities. So the reality is that I don't think they're going to come knocking on your door and saying, so we see that you ticked that you'd reviewed your rules, and tell us more. There's just not the capacity. There's been public service cuts that we all know about. But the principle is a good one. So even if you're not going to get the knock on the door, I think that what they're trying to do is encourage organizations to be clear on your purpose. That should be the beating heart of your organization, and to be very clear about how you operate, because it will save you trouble in the future when there's a dispute or a problem, if you have clear rules and everyone understands how things are done. So for your own health, not just what would the regulator say. I think it's actually a good principle for all of us to adopt anyway. Great. And looks like John had put something there about the rules at the top level applying to parishes and things. Yeah. Yeah. It does depend on your context and how it is that the relationships work. So it would probably need to get a bit more information. Yeah.
We just before I hand over to you to read our bedtime story for us, Stephen.
Yeah.
I was in a meeting today with the national church, the heads of national churches, and we had the privilege of having Dr. Juliet Chevalier Watts present to us. Some of you she's been in the media recently. She's a researcher from Waikato University. She is an atheist. She does not believe in God at all. However, she believes in the power of the local church to make a positive impact on society and community. She started her research to disprove the church and say we should be taxed. And now she is an absolute advocate for the church. And so you may hear and see some of her media pieces in the coming days around that. But one of her challenges to the national church leaders today was around telling our story. She said, "You guys are hiding your light under a bushel. You need an atheist to tell your story." And so it was a real challenge about how do we in today's society with technology and everything within our own congregations and wherever we get the opportunity to tell the good story of what the church is doing and what charitable organizations are doing for the good of Aotearoa and the people that call this nation their home. And so it was a real good challenge to kind of hear that from her. And of course, we're incredibly grateful for the work and time she's putting in to be an advocate for us to say, government, you should not be taxing churches or charities. You should be finding ways to help them. So that's a challenge for us to think about how to get that story out there and that positive influence story about lives being changed. But Steven, thank you so much again for giving up your evening and spending this time with us. And I think we will do a part two, and so keep an eye out for that in the months to come. I think that would be great. But just however you want to feed in questions or things that you'd like to do. Yeah, we could do a session on privacy, and there'll be a few other things I guess that we could touch on that would be relevant to all of us. But thank you again so much, Steven. Really, really appreciate your wisdom and the work that you do in this space for us. So God bless you and thank you. And thank you to all of you out there who are involved in leading churches, leading charities, on boards, that have put your hand up and said, yeah, look, I'll help in the governance space. So thank you so much for all that you're doing, and may God bless you in that endeavor as well. Steven.
Great, thank you so much. And in the chat, I just put a link to something that Juliet put out it was on RNZ the other day as well, about charities and things. So so this is going to take us back. It takes about 5 minutes to read this story. It is a little bit like going back to a preschool, it's let's sit on the mat. But I wrote this story to encourage people like all of you. So I hope that it is encouraging. Feel free. I know there's other commitments and everything, but if you'd like to stay, then I'm going to read it. It's called The Apple Tree. And I would just ask if you could imagine in your mind a little green valley, and at the bottom of the green valley there's a stream which is flowing, and all you can hear is the sound of the water on the rocks as it makes its way through the valley. There's some birds in the air, but there's no distractions. There's no airplanes, there's no cars, there's no phone calls. It's a very peaceful place. And I'm going to read this to you. There's 4 parts to it. So there's spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And some people tell me that they find it helpful to close their eyes and just listen to my voice as I'm reading it, but totally up to you. So have a listen to this story, The Apple Tree. Part 1, Spring. I remember the small boy who used to visit me in the summer. He planted me here one day with his grandmother. They were exploring, and they ended up in this small valley, so far out of the way. I overheard the grandmother say that she had come to this same spot with her own grandparents many years before. They planted me beside this slow-moving stream that drifts lazily by, tossing light back up into my branches like confetti. I've long ago given up trying to work out what there might be to celebrate here. The stream itself babbles constantly, but it cannot hold much of a conversation. It speaks over and over of rocks and sand, of fish and frogs, of eddies and flows. But I'm grateful for the stream, for my roots found it long ago, and much of the surrounding land is parched in the summer. If I had not been laid down so carefully to grow on its banks, I might have withered long ago. Let's see what happens, the grandmother said slowly. Through the soil that they placed on me, I heard their footsteps retreating. Part 2, Summer. I can't tell you much about the next few years as I emerged from seed to leaf to small tree. The boy returned during the summer and pruned me as I grew larger. He would often just sit there beside me or lean against me as I grew. Only a few times did his grandmother join him, and I watched as she grew older more quickly than the boy and I grew up. They had long talks there, sitting beneath me, and I listened in to each one. They talked of the past, the present, the future. I recall the final time I saw the grandmother as she struggled to her feet, leaning on a walking stick after sitting down under my shade. When the boy came the next summer, he was even more reflective than he had been on earlier visits, and he sat there, just watching the water flow by. He was thinking, throwing small stones, and listening to their sound, being still and silent. The last time I saw the boy, he had grown into a man. I was proud because I had started to produce some apples, and I saw him grab one and eat it. Then I noticed that he had in his hands an axe, and I shivered as he drew even closer and raised it. He used it to hack at me, and after several deep cuts, he took off the branch that was growing out and away from the stream. He had shifted my angles, and this left me only to droop out over the water. I felt like he had cut off an arm, and I resented it. The apples that had been on the branch lay scattered on the ground. Even then, I knew that this was going to determine my destiny in some way. The man cut away at the branch lying there, unattached and yet so intimately connected to me, until he had fashioned the straightest part into a walking stick. Was that all I was useful for? I felt a great betrayal, yet before he left, he stood up before me, and the wind went quiet, the birds in my branches stopped singing, and the sun shone brighter. I take a piece of you to guide me, he said. He addressed me so formally that despite my indignity, I bowed to him as best I could. Then he was gone to live his life, leaving me alone. Part 3. Autumn. As time went by, the seasons were my only companions. They stayed long enough to feel comfortable with each other, not like the small birds that flew in and out so quickly that I couldn't even focus on them. In the winters, the snow that fell chilled me deeply, but the serene silence that resulted was worth it. Spring saw me grow again and push out new blossoms, each one representing a possible future. In the summers, my apples grew and grew larger in the sun. I was proud of them, and as the days shortened, they fell from me. I was most upset in the autumns, for by taking part of me away, the man had left only one place for the apples I produced to fall. The stream gratefully received each of them, making a sound as they slipped into the water like divers. All I could do was watch them drift away downstream and around the bend. It made me sad to see them leave. At that time of year, I resented the man greatly. Although as a boy he had given me life and looked after me, he had also destroyed my chances for a friend, since no tree could grow there with me. All those possible companions were swept downstream to nothingness. I kept asking myself why this had happened to me. Part 4. Winter. The years rolled by, and each year my resentment grew with my height. My bark had become knobbled and rough. I was old now. Yet still I produced fruit each season, hoping that one day they might land beside me and grow there. I towered high above the stream, but my wish was not granted. The apples dropped each time into the water to float away. I could feel a coldness within myself. The dark began to take over as I questioned all I stood for and often reflected on how I had achieved nothing. Then one day, an old man came walking into the valley with a small girl. Something stirred in me as they drew near, a memory of long ago. It had been several decades since I had last seen a person in these parts. This man reminded me of the grandmother who had helped plant me, for he walked slowly, yet purposefully. They sat under my branches with their backs against my trunk, and they watched the water. I listened to them talk of the past, the present, the future. Then the little girl asked, "Is this really the source of them all, grandfather?" The old man nodded. "Yes," he replied, "and the thing is that this old tree probably doesn't even know." He smiled wistfully. "What do you mean?" asked the little girl. I too leaned in closer, listening hard. "Well, look at the bend over there," he said. "You see, this tree has no way of looking beyond this valley, of seeing past its own limited view. It has no way of knowing that for miles and miles down from here, the stream is lined with apple trees, and that they have all come from this one source. For years, the tree has been faithfully dropping its apples into the stream, and the water has washed them up to places far beyond the realm of what this tree could have ever thought possible. They were quiet then, and I was too, as I reflected on what was said. This brief conversation had opened a new perspective, and had healed something within. They had brought lunch with them, and when they were done, the small girl dug 2 holes along the bank, one upstream from me and one a little way down. I saw her place something in them and cover them up. Then she came back to sit beside her grandfather, who said slowly, "Let's see what happens." As they got up to leave, I saw the old man struggling to stand. The girl reached out to help, and she handed him something, and I recognized the walking stick. I made my leaves move in the wind, and I bent closer as the years of resentment fell away. I smiled down at the boy who had planted me so many years before. He also looked up at me, and he tipped his hat. Then he took his granddaughter's hand in his, and I watched them walk away. So that's the end of the story. I hope it was an interesting little parable. That's actually what it is. And I have a question for you, which I put in the end of the book. So it's basically a picture book. There's lots of illustrations through it. And this is the question that I ask. Who is like the apple tree in your life? Who is someone who's been like that for you or for your community or the groups that you're involved in, who's been faithfully dropping the apples, planting the seeds? And here's my question for you. When did you last tell them how much you appreciate them, how much you value the years of service that they've given, and acknowledge the trees which have grown as a result of their faithful service? So that's the outward looking, who is the apple tree in your life? Please go tell them how much you appreciate them. But then, of course, there's the inner side here. Each of you are apple trees. Each of you are planting seeds. You are having an effect on people, but you may not see the result right away. You may not see the result in your lifetime, but what you're doing matters. So in the mahi, in the work, when it gets difficult, just remember that a little bit like this apple tree, you can be planting seeds and know that maybe it's in a year, 5 years, 10 years, maybe it's not something you will ever see, but what you do matters. So be encouraged that your work is important and that it is seen and valuable. So that's the little story. It's been read out at many places. I think it got read out at a Methodist gathering recently. It was read out at the opening of the Wellington City Mission. About 250 people were there, including senior government officials and people. So yeah, it's something that I hope is a blessing for you to hear the story. I do actually have about 1,000 copies left in my garage. So if it is of interest to you, then drop me an email and I can make sure I'm selling it, to be honest. So I'm getting it out to people that it can then be used as a tool to tell that story and maybe bless other people. So thank you everyone for joining. Chris, I really had a lot of fun. I think we should do a part 2. I would love to hear what questions you would like me to address. As you could tell, there's a lot more that we could have gone into, like, for example, what are your duties? What exactly are they, and how do we keep safe? So drop maybe Chris or I a line if you can think of some topics you'd like to cover, and then maybe we can set up some additional calls. And this has been
Definitely.
recorded, and we'll send it out as a link so that you are welcome to forward it on to other members of your leadership teams as well. So thank you for joining
Right.
us. Chris, I'll pass back to you maybe to say the final word.
Yeah, no, and really that is just again just a huge thank you, Stephen, for your time and for your expertise, and for that beautiful story. I've heard it a number of times now, and it's a blessing every time. And so yes, so thank you, and thank you for using what God has gifted you with to help the body of Christ and other organizations as they grapple with all of this stuff that we do have to get our heads around. So thank you so much, Stephen. And yes, we will do a part two in the coming months. So just keep an eye out for that. So yeah, let us know your questions of things you may want for us to address. But I'm sure we could come up with some anyway, Stephen. There's plenty of things to talk about. So
Yeah, we tend to brainstorm well together, so I'm sure that there's a long list. But I'd
there
love
will
to
be,
hear from
absolutely.
people, and also if anybody has questions, people always get shocked that I make this offer. Chris knows what I'm about to say. I have a commute every day. I would rather talk with someone doing something meaningful and not charge or anything, just have a conversation, than I would listen to the radio. So feel free to reach out if that's of interest, and yeah, we can work out if we could support you if you do need a review of rules or things like that. So great.
Right. How often do you get a lawyer giving you free time, eh? So there we go. Great stuff. Hey, let me just close our time in prayer. Father God, we just thank you again for the privilege it is to serve you. Lord, I know sometimes it can be frustrating, sometimes it can be hard, it can be difficult. We have to have difficult conversations at times and grapple with some hard things. But Father, I pray that you'd help remind us of the bigger picture of the why we do what we do. And so, Father, I just pray your blessing upon every person that's been part of this call tonight, that's involved in leadership and eldership, trusteeship, governance in their organizations and in their churches. Lord, we ask for your wisdom. Your word says that if we ask, you will give. And Father, we do ask for your wisdom that we would be able to be blessings to our communities, that we'd be able to make a difference to the kingdom of God in this nation and beyond. And Lord, that we would find real purpose and fulfillment in the work that you call us to do. Pray your blessing upon Stephen, Lord, upon Perryfield and all that they do. We thank you for the gift they are to the body of Christ. And we just commit our time together and ourselves to you. In your mighty name we pray. Amen. God bless. Thank you, everybody.